On the morning of April 14th, 1935, a farmer on the Oklahoma plains looked west and saw a black wall swallowing the entire horizon. That day would come to be known as Black Sunday, and what happened in the hours that followed would change America forever. More than 40 million hectares of farmland were destroyed, roughly equal to the entire agricultural area of California and Texas combined. The Dust Bowl was the single largest human-caused environmental disaster in American history, a catastrophe that came not from nature, but from the hands of the very people who plowed this land. Scientists and the government knew these plains were dying years before the worst hit, but no one stopped, not until the dust storms swallowed an entire civilization. This is the story of what happens when humans conquer nature, and nature strikes back. To understand why the Dust Bowl happened, we need to go back decades before, when the Great Plains was still an endless ocean of tall grass stretching for thousands of kilometers. That native grassland had taken thousands of years to form, with roots reaching 3 meters deep into the earth, anchoring the precious topsoil below like a vast biological carpet. Then after 1900, the U.S. government opened the Great Plains to new settlers with a simple promise: free land, just plow and plant. Millions of acres of native grassland were plowed under within decades, replaced by wheat, cotton, and monoculture fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The 1920s brought good rain and high wheat prices, so farmers bought more tractors, broke more land, and believed the Great Plains would feed the world forever. But the Great Plains was not a reliably wet region. It was a semi-arid ecosystem so fragile that a single decade of drought could shatter everything. In 1930, the drought began. Not a gradual fading of rain, but a complete disappearance of water, as if the sky had simply closed a valve. With no native grass roots to hold it in place, the 1,000-year-old topsoil began to loosen grain by grain, waiting for the wind to carry it away. In 1931, the first dust storms appeared, small at first, just enough to darken the midday sky, but enough for farmers to sense that something was deeply wrong. By 1932, more than 14 major dust storms had swept the Great Plains, but that was only the opening chapter of what was coming. The land was not just drying, it was dying, and the relentless wind of the Great Plains now had something to carry: the entire topsoil layer of an agricultural civilization. Then 1934 arrived, the hottest year in American history to that point, and the dust storms stopped being small and became something that had never had a name before. The hardest-hit Central Zone covered the entire Oklahoma Panhandle, Texas Panhandle, southwestern Kansas, southeastern Colorado, and northeastern New Mexico, a region people began calling the Dirty 30s. This was a land so flat that people said you could see a storm coming 3 days away, but there was nowhere to hide from it. And then, on April 14th, 1935, on a warm and quiet Sunday afternoon, the wind shifted to the north in Kansas. The dust wall approaching was 1,800 meters tall, moving at nearly 100 kilometers per hour, carrying an estimated 200 million tons of displaced topsoil. Within minutes, day would become night, and no one knew that Black Sunday would be the moment America finally had to confront what it had done to this land. At 7 in the evening, on April 14th, 1935, the dust wall hit Boise City, Oklahoma, and temperatures dropped 17 degrees Celsius in less than 1 hour. Inside that storm, visibility was zero, not a few meters, not a few centimeters, but absolute zero. A person could extend their arm and not see their own hand. The static electricity inside the storm was so intense it killed car engines, sent sparks leaping from barbed wire fences, and made it impossible for people to shake hands without being shocked. Think about it this way. This was not ordinary dirt. Every particle in this storm was a fragment of someone's topsoil, a piece of a wheat field a family had spent a lifetime building. Dust from Oklahoma fell on Chicago, Dust from Kansas coated ships 500 kilometers out in the Atlantic Ocean, and dust from the Texas Panhandle appeared on surfaces in Washington, D.C. When Dust Bowl dust fell on the U.S. Capitol in Washington in 1935, Hugh Hammond Bennett, head of the Soil Conservation Service, was in the middle of testifying before the Senate about the very crisis unfolding outside. He no longer needed to argue his case. Nature had made the argument by knocking on the Senate chamber door, but the visible dust storm was only one symptom of a chain of consequences no one had fully anticipated. Because when the topsoil was gone, the water table followed. This was no longer just about failed harvests. This was the moment an entire territory larger than the whole of Vietnam was turning into desert in real time. The largest storms reached an intensity called a black blizzard, because they spiraled upward like winter snowstorms, but carried soil instead of snow, and turned day into absolute night. In the 6 years from 1930 to 1936, more than 100 major dust storms swept the Great Plains, an average of 8 per year, peaking in 1935 with 40 storms in a single year. Think about what that meant for a farm family trying to survive. 40 times in a single year, the sky became the enemy, and everything they had built was buried under someone else's soil. The dust was not only outdoors, it invaded every crack of the house, through door gaps, through keyholes, through fractures in the plaster, and people woke the next morning with a thin layer of soil across their faces. This is where disaster became medical tragedy, because the fine silica dust of the Great Plains, when inhaled repeatedly, caused a condition doctors called dust pneumonia. Hospitals in small towns were overwhelmed, especially with children and the elderly, whose weaker lungs could not survive years of daily dust inhalation. 7,000 people died from dust pneumonia across the 1930s, a hidden number because no one kept an official count and no memorial anywhere carries their names. But the second silent killer of the Dust Bowl was not dust, it was poverty, because when the land died, farmers had nothing to sell and no way to buy food. Consider this. During the 1930s, wheat prices dropped to 25 cents a bushel, below the cost of production, which meant the harder a farmer worked, the deeper into debt they fell. This is the moment the Dust Bowl became what historians call the largest peacetime migration in American history. More than 2.5 million people abandoned their homes in 6 years. People called them Okies, though many were not from Oklahoma, a name that carried the contempt reserved for those who had lost everything and were forced to start over on an asphalt road. Route 66, the road from Oklahoma City to Los Angeles, became the highway of desperation, where columns of battered trucks carrying the last possessions of ruined families rolled westward. When they reached California, they found not paradise but signs reading, "No help wanted," large farms paying wages below the cost of survival, and temporary camps that were little more than open-air slums. What does 2.5 million displaced people mean? That is more than the entire population of metropolitan Houston, Texas, forced to pack up and leave within 6 years, with nowhere waiting to welcome them. Towns emptied mid-season, schools closed mid-year, churches stood abandoned, and post offices stopped receiving mail because there were no addresses left to deliver to. But not everyone left. Some stayed, because this land was all they had ever known, and leaving meant admitting that their entire lives had been a mistake. These were the people who invented dust mulching, loosening the surface soil into a crumbly layer to create a barrier, preventing the fine particles beneath from blowing. A desperate solution that sometimes worked. In the darkest years of 1934 and 1935, no measurable rainfall fell across large sections of the region for 12 consecutive months. And after the drought came grasshoppers, as if nature wanted to ensure that whatever survived the storms and drying would not survive what followed. The swarms stripped fields bare within hours, consuming wooden tool handles, wooden utility poles, and even laundry on clotheslines for the salt in the sweat, a third layer of catastrophe stacked on two previous ones. When historians look at the Dust Bowl, the most staggering number is not lives lost, but the speed of land loss. In a single day in May 1934, one dust storm removed 300 million tons of topsoil in a single afternoon. 300 million tons. That is enough soil to fill a channel 2 meters deep and 2 meters wide, stretching 7.5 times around the circumference of the entire Earth. The science behind the dust storm was not complex, and that is precisely what makes it so painful, because it was entirely preventable had people understood how soil works. The black topsoil of the Great Plains was the product of 10 to 12,000 years of native grass, dying and decaying, accumulating at about 2.5 millimeters per year, and could be lost in a single storm season. When wind exceeded the threshold of about 20 kilometers per hour across bare ground, soil particles began moving in a chain reaction called saltation, bouncing forward in small jumps and dislodging other particles on impact. That is why dust storms did not merely move soil from one place to another, but created more dust as they moved, each landing particle releasing 10 more, the storm generating its own fuel. While the people of the Great Plains endured, Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the White House, reading handwritten letters from farmers, describing scenes he could not imagine from Washington. The Roosevelt administration began buying starving cattle from destroyed farms at $30 to $35 per head, giving farmers just enough money to survive through winter. But the cattle program was a bandage on a wound that needed surgery, because the core problem was the soil itself, and no one in government knew exactly what to do about soil, until Hugh Hammond Bennett of the USDA proposed a radical idea. Instead of just helping farmers survive each dry season, teach them to farm in ways that kept the soil from blowing away. Contour plowing, windbreak planting, and seasonal fallowing were techniques known for years, but there had never been sufficient urgency to implement them at scale until the Dust Bowl made it unavoidable. During the darkest phase of 1935 and 1936, some parts of Oklahoma recorded temperatures exceeding 45 degrees Celsius for weeks at a stretch, combined with dust that made the air essentially unbreathable during daylight hours. On those days, people did everything indoors at night and rested during the day if possible. But houses had no air conditioning, no effective fans, and indoor temperatures nearly matched the outside. Children who grew up during the Dust Bowl did not know that the sky could be blue in the morning and still blue by afternoon, because for them, the sky was always the brown-yellow of suspended dust. Schools closed on the worst storm days not by safety regulation, but because the sky darkened so completely that students could not see the blackboard even by kerosene lamp, and the classroom air was as thick as indoor fog. The dust storms did not discriminate by wealth in the destruction they brought, but they were very democratic in driving people away. Both landowners and sharecroppers loaded their vehicles and left, just with very different amounts of starting capital. And while people abandoned the land, some farmers discovered something strange. The soil beneath plots where native grass had never been plowed was not eroding the same way as the cultivated fields. That was living proof, right in front of everyone, that the Great Plains itself was not broken. The farming practices were broken, and if the land was properly covered, the wind could take nothing. That lesson would reshape all of American agricultural policy for the 20th century. But before that, one final phase of the Dust Bowl had to be endured. 1936, the worst year within the worst decade. In 1936, the drought expanded beyond the Great Plains, pushing deep into the Midwest, and total U.S. wheat production fell to 40% of normal output. This was no longer just a plains farmer's crisis. It was a threat to the entire national food supply of a country already struggling through the Great Depression. Roosevelt faced a major decision: resettle tens of thousands of farm families from the destroyed land to new territory, or invest in restoring the devastated land itself? The answer was ultimately both, but at the center of the strategy was a project unprecedented in American agricultural history, planting 220 million trees in a belt stretching from Canada down to Texas. The Prairie States Forestry Project, also called the Great Plains Shelter Belt, used living trees as a biological wall to break wind before it could accelerate to the speed needed to lift topsoil. Where shelter belts were planted and maintained, erosion dropped by up to 90% compared to unprotected open fields, and that was the first proof that humans could slow what they had started. Rain finally returned to some areas in 1936. But rainfall was not the end of the story, because rain falling on stripped bare land ran off immediately as flash floods, not soaking in, but washing away the remaining surface particles. That was the second lesson of the Dust Bowl. Restoring land was not simply stopping the plow and waiting for rain, but a long and expensive process requiring techniques, patience, and money that many farmers no longer possessed. In 1937, the U.S. Congress passed the first federal soil conservation law in history, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, formally recognizing that soil was a national resource, not merely private property. At the same time, the federal government began buying back millions of the most severely destroyed acres, converting them to national grasslands and allowing them to return to native vegetation over decades. The Dust Bowl also profoundly changed how Americans thought about photography and social documentation, because it was the first disaster comprehensively documented in images by photographers working for the Farm Security Administration. The photographs of Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, and Russell Lee from the FSA program brought the Great Plains crisis into the minds of urban Americans for the first time, forcing an entire nation to look at what many had been ignoring. John Steinbeck read the FSA reports and letters from Oklahoma and wrote The Grapes of Wrath, the novel that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1938 and gave the world a name for the people the Dust Bowl had torn from their land. Normal rainfall returned to much of the Great Plains by 1939, ending the extended drought phase. But what returned was not the land of the years before, because the topsoil that had made it fertile was no longer there. What had made that land fertile had taken 12,000 years to form, and 6 years of dust storms had blown most of it away permanently, never to return within any human timescale. When rain returned and people tried to assess the damage, the figures could not be measured in hectares or tons of soil, but in communities that had vanished completely from the map. 1/3 of all farms in the affected zone were abandoned, many with no buyers because no one wanted land stripped of its topsoil, leaving only clay and caliche limestone beneath. The total economic damage of the Dust Bowl is estimated at roughly $25 billion in current value. But that figure cannot account for the lost topsoil itself, which has no market price because it cannot be bought back. 2.5 million people had left, and most never returned. The population of some Oklahoma Panhandle counties fell by more than 50% and has never recovered to pre-Dust Bowl levels to this day. Children raised in California migrant camps carried what later psychologists would call displaced persons syndrome, an invisible wound that persisted through generations, the trauma of a people who lost the ground beneath their feet. The shelter belt planting and conservation programs gradually produced results through the 1940s. Combined with returning rainfall and wartime agricultural prices rising due to the Second World War, giving the families who stayed a path back. But the Great Plains never fully recovered. Soil scientists measuring the region show that most of the worst affected land still lacks 20 to 50% of its original pre-Dust Bowl topsoil depth to this day. This is the consequence that no GDP figure can capture. the permanent reduction in agricultural potential of one of the most fertile regions on the planet, a loss measured in centuries rather than decades. The environmental impact of the Dust Bowl did not stop at the Great Plains. The dust and sand deposited across the eastern United States altered soil chemistry and ecosystems in regions people would never have associated with the Oklahoma and Texas Panhandle. The Dust Bowl also permanently changed the relationship between the federal government and American citizens, because for the first time, the government formally acknowledged that an environmental disaster was a national problem requiring a national response. But the most important political legacy of the Dust Bowl was not the agencies it created, but the paradigm shift in how humans understood soil itself. That soil was not a commodity, but an ecosystem requiring stewardship. The farmers who remained in the Great Plains after the Dust Bowl became the most soil-conscious generation in American history, because they had watched with their own eyes what happens when land is not respected. The question the Dust Bowl left for future generations was not whether this could happen again, but whether we were already recreating the conditions that made it possible. The Ogallala Aquifer, the massive underground water body beneath the Great Plains, feeding 1/3 of all American irrigated agriculture, is being pumped out at 10 to 40 times the rate of natural recharge. If the Ogallala Aquifer runs dry, a scenario possible within 2 to 3 generations in some areas, the Great Plains will lose its irrigation water and face again the dry farming conditions similar to those of the 1930s. And if it happens again, there will be no groundwater to fall back on, because the last time the Ogallala was fully recharged was 15,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, under climatic conditions that no longer exist. The people remaining in the Great Plains know this and live with it daily. Farmers and ranchers asking whether their grandchildren will be able to work this land, the same questions their grandparents asked in the 1930s. The Dust Bowl created America's first early warning system for soil erosion. A network of soil and wind monitoring stations across the Great Plains, the direct predecessor of the environmental monitoring systems NOAA, operates today. The conservation farming methods developed from the Dust Bowl, contour plowing, seasonal fallowing, windbreak planting, and post-harvest stubble retention are now taught and applied in more than 60 countries worldwide. In the Sahel, the semi-arid zone just south of the Sahara, stretching from Senegal to Ethiopia, millions of farmers are facing conditions nearly identical to what the Great Plains endured in the 1930s. Yet, in the Sahel, a reforestation program called the Great Green Wall is underway, a project planting an 8,000-kilometer green belt from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, directly inspired by the lesson of the Great Plains Shelter Belt. Australia, Kazakhstan, China, and many other countries are struggling with large-scale soil erosion across their semi-arid plains, and each of them is relearning the lesson that the Great Plains had to pay for with 2.5 million displaced people and 6 years of disaster. Climate change is complicating this further, because rising temperatures and longer drought cycles across the Great Plains are creating what some scientists call pre-Dust Bowl conditions, the preconditions of catastrophe on American soil once again. And the Ogallala Aquifer, the single largest difference between the Great Plains of today and the Great Plains of the 1930s, is shrinking every year in a way that no government on Earth currently knows how to stop economically. The lessons of the Dust Bowl taught us that ecosystems do not collapse piece by piece in recognizable ways. They accumulate pressure in silence for decades and then fail faster than anyone predicted. This is what modern science calls a tipping point, when a system absorbs pressure for too long and too deeply, then transitions in a time frame completely disproportionate to the years of accumulation. The Great Plains today still produces 1/5 of the entire world's wheat supply, feeding hundreds of millions of people across every continent, and that is why what happens to this land has never been only an American problem. On the afternoon of April 14th, 1935, the 1,800-meter dust wall taught America the most expensive lesson in its agricultural history: that soil is not an infinite resource. Soil is the foundation of everything, and when the soil is gone, everything else goes with it. That dust wall disappeared within hours, but the question it raised has never been answered. Have we truly learned our lesson, or are we simply waiting for the next time?